Well, supposedly I'm live, but it's cut out the first 30 seconds of the past couple, so I won't say anything too important. I'll just settle in for a moment here. Look at that. 32 seconds in, same as yesterday, I think. Restarted. I don't know what that's about. Well, anyway, so here we are. I can't decide if I want to actually take some time to think through if I should like post this in certain advertising platforms or whatever. Or if I want to think about more like the metamodern content itself. Like, I keep talking about solving the coordination problem, and people keep being like, well, no, that wouldn't work because here's an obstacle. And it's like, of course, there's an obstacle. Yes, there are many, many obstacles. Merely observing the existence of an obstacle is hopefully the beginning of the analysis and not the end. The coordination problem. I um I was reflecting that it seems like reality has solved the coordination problem. I mean, first it's created it, suffered under it, and then eventually solved it over and over again in the physical universe. And I am enjoying using the mold spore analogy. You can put some mold spores in a petri dish, some food around the thing, and they'll grow out from the original spot, having no knowledge of where's the high utility, where's the food. They don't know. But they follow a growth algorithm, and the spores grow out, and there's many of them, but because they're all doing it together, they display a sort of swarm intelligence, and they solve the coordination problem. What if they couldn't do this? If they couldn't uh, venture out from where they started, they would just sit there until they died. And if any of them went out alone, they would fail rather than finding the food source. Thus, they are doomed unless they solve the coordination problem, but mold spores are already all united, following similar rules and principles. And when you put tons of little cells together, but who have learned to follow the same overarching principle, then they get to venture out, not alone, but side by side with each other. And that helps them, one, survive better, and two, be smarter. They compute better like that. They find the food. So that's one example of the coordination problem existing and then having already been solved. I'd like to come up with a couple of other quick examples for pedagogical purposes. But the main point is before you solve the coordination problem, maybe you try a bunch of times and it fails every time. I mean, I look at Martin Luther King and Gandhi as people who, in a small, localized, partial way, kind of solved the coordination problem. Or maybe it was more like they were looking in that direction and they were so inspirational to people that others looked in that same direction with them. And they started to display the kind of swarm intelligence properties that a coordinated community of cells can. And I wonder what it's like to be on the inside of that, because it's one thing to sit on the outside and observe, like, yeah, it's smarter, it's more harmonious, but on the inside, it's like we've been going about this all wrong. We just got this little taste of something, and it seems like it's stronger, it's smarter, it's better for all of us. We're more harmonized. What if we all did this? What if we solved the coordination problem at scale? What kind of problems could we solve? And Martin Luther King starts to dream, and he shares his dream. And it's a dream of harmonized coordination, solved coordination problems, and basically the emergence of swarm intelligence. If we were just smarter, we could solve our problems. We don't have to be individually smarter. Evolution will take too long to make that happen. But we can be collectively way smarter than we are right now. Right now, we're like globally like a baby. You can get smarter than that. And if we can bump up to even like toddler levels of intelligence at a superorganism level, then a whole host of our problems will simply fall to the side as we sweep them aside with an effortless wave of our newly coordinated collective hands. Martin Luther King, Gandhi. I feel like there's a spirit, a principle, this harmonious coordination that emerges. They start to talk about things like love, but it's also interesting that you can say very straightforwardly that swarm intelligence, although it may be built on something sort of like love or faith in each other, good faith, mutual reliance, but what it produces is intelligence. And I'd heard this idea in the New Age sort of, I'd say traditions, they're younger traditions, but the claim that love is intelligence, but seeing that shift before and after the emergence of swarm intelligence helps me feel like I see that a little bit clearer. Michael Levin says our whole bodies are swarm intelligence. What you think of as you is the product of swarm intelligence. And from that perspective, it's like, is there more of a connection between intelligence and love from that perspective? Because why does this collection of human cells produce, various levels of computation and intelligence, and then ultimately sort of the highest level? And the answer is that they talk to each other and they coordinate. They share an EM field, they share a metabolism. They act for the good of the sort of community of the whole, and they survive better individually because they're united in that purpose. And somewhere upstream of all the billions or trillions, I don't know, of cells exchanging things, somewhere along the line, it somehow adds up to you, to me. So the connection between love and intelligence is there's maybe something really there. And maybe you really could say that the followers of like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, they talked about love, but they also displayed a type of power, a type of intelligence, an ability to coordinate, built on the foundation of a context of something like love. I saw another, here's a fictional example, but one I like maybe the most is in Spartacus, a movie from 1960. Spartacus, a slave. Spartacus, who's been facing death and suffering for decades, his entire life, and who says that when a free man dies, he loses the pleasure of life. When a slave dies, he loses the pain of life. And that's why he's not afraid to die. And we talk about people who have these brushes with death, and a lot of them come out on the other side of it, powerfully transformed, a radically different perspective on life, freer of suffering, freer of anxieties and neuroses. What's going on? Well, a slave, this kind of slave that Spartacus was, they just faced that their entire lives. And there's a kind of a superpower that emerges from that. And so when Spartacus kicks off this slave rebellion, they're all sort of starting to come together and grow, and they're trying to figure out a way to get out of Rome and be free. And we get to see play out in the movie, at least the writer's vision of how the organization of the various gladiators and slaves comes together. How do they transform from scattered individuals, even friends to some degree, but a band of unorganized raiders? And then somehow they come together and it's played. Spartacus is the eventual leader. It's interesting that he's not the leader from the beginning, but after a while of everybody having a good time and raiding and drinking and so forth, he comes together and says, We should be looking for bread and not wine, and we should be focusing on our own genuine well-being and not on like punishing the Romans around us, that we can sort of take pleasure in getting our revenge on them. And as the organization of the slave army starts to come together, we see Spartacus's leading style. And I don't know, I would love to talk with the writer, although this is a 64-year-old movie, but I'd love to ask, like, what were you trying to show exactly here? Because to me, it's like a perfect recipe. I put it, right there with Martin Luther King and Gandhi. It's like he doesn't do the top-down ruling thing. At one point they've beaten a commander, and they bring him to Spartacus, and he's like, "What are you going to do with me?" And he's like, "I don't know." And he says, "What are we going to do with him?" And he opens it up to everybody. And one of them cracks a joke, and that's not a serious answer. But he opened it up, and then he makes the decision himself. But, little microcosm example there. He's coordinating, he's leading, he's not dictating though. He doesn't have a title, not really. He has a sort of brotherly relationship, and that's the idea: is that the slave army becomes an army of brothers. And the Romans at the end, scoffing, saying they're going to put to test this myth of slave brotherhood. That's what I'm talking about when I make the comparison to Martin Luther King and so on. Is Spartacus was organizing a group of people, not by dictate, but by something like shared vision and shared common good, genuine good faith attempts to pursue the common good. He later at the end, he gets the opportunity to leave the army behind to doom and to escape to wealth for the rest of his life. But he doesn't even. He immediately shuts down the offer, sends them away, and goes to die with everybody else. And then at the very end, the Romans say, "Hey, we'll let all of you live and go back to being slaves, except Spartacus. You got to give us Spartacus, and we're going to crucify him." And he's about to give himself up. And then a slave brother by his side stands up and says that he's Spartacus, and another stands up. And the whole army eventually stands up, and they're all saying they're Spartacus. Here's another interesting comparison to Gandhi. Gandhi said that they should have done something rather like this. They did something a little bit like this, and the British said, "Well, we can't crucify them all," and they let them go. And then Gandhi said, "Do it with the Nazis." Well, Spartacus and the army did it with the Romans, and the Romans crucified all of them. So that's an interesting note. But, it's an ignoble end, and an ignoble end, or it's a very noble end. It's such a noble end that we're still talking about it, that we still remember it, that we're inspired by it. And on some level, you could say, what a waste. On another level, you could say they would be dead by now anyway. Sure, they could have lived a few decades longer, each of them. But if it's going to happen anyway, and I wonder if that's part of the superpower of the slave, it's like you already have nothing and can be hurt and killed at any time. You have no control and no power. Now what? And they somehow live. And they get over certain things that the rest of us don't. And with science and civilization, we've made it a lot easier to pretend that we can sort of stave off death. But all we've done is stave off violent and unexpected death. That might seem like a big improvement, and it is. And at the same time, on the level of dealing with the fact that you're going to die, it doesn't really change things at all, except to allow you your illusions. So a lot of people, I think, in recent history in places like America, I suspect many of them didn't really face death. Decades and decades of their life, prosperity was just rising. most prosperous place in the world, so much culturally going on, medicine getting better and better. It's like, hey, by the time I was going to die, maybe they'll have got a new medicine and I'll just live longer. But at some point, you age and you face death. And you can learn a lot from doing that. And then you can regret it a lot that you didn't learn it sooner. And so it seems like it might be worth helping each citizen of a genuinely robust, strong group to face what cannot be ignored. It would be one thing if we could get rid of it, but there are certain burdens of being that come as part of the package. And that means there's no getting away from them. And so the only question is if you're going to face them or not. And then maybe you should do so the sooner the better. And many cultures have seemed to do harsh or strange, very strange things. But now I look at them and I'm like, oh, well, yeah, the alternative could have been worse. Like comedians will joke about Christianity, about the crucifixion. Like, it's supposed to be all peace and love. And then I come in every church around the world, there's like this bleeding, pain ridden, tortured guy. And it's like, yeah, like life's rough, like life's really rough. We're going to teach you that from day one. And hopefully, if we all know together that life is rough, we don't have any illusions about it, we can at least work together to make it less pointlessly horrible than it has to be. And maybe we can start to get ready and come to terms with our eventual demise, whether it's violent and unexpected or if it's, at the end of a long life. And this was a little bit the myth, I think, that supported our illusions about somehow having vanquished death, is we told the story that death somehow didn't count. It wasn't scary or something if it happened the right way. If you die in the perfect way, peacefully in your sleep and old age after a long and fulfilling life, then, facing the specter of your unraveling from the inside and the deterioration of your health, 100% it'll deteriorate as long as it takes until it can't even keep itself alive anymore. And it's like, great. Yeah, happy ending now. You got the best death. And it's like, right, the best death is still like not something to be ignored your entire life in the hopes that you can brush by it in a quick, peaceful passing away in your sleep. So, Spartacus had all of this. It's funny when they first get free and they're reveling in their freedom, and it's like you're still in Rome. They're on their way to come destroy you. You have no chance. But there's the scene where he meets up with the slave girl he met before, and they're just giddy. Nobody can tell you what to do. Nobody can tell you who you have to be with. Nobody can tell you where you have to go or say that it's time for you to die. And they're just giddy over it. And it's like, yeah, I mean, 9 months later, it's over. But to the slave, it was like, I never thought I'd have those 9 months in the first place. So they have an almost sort of idyllic, sort of brotherhood, sisterhood thing going on where they're acting a little bit like a coordinated multicellular organism with a shared vision, following a leader in some sense, but not because the leader provides dictated instructions, but because the leader kind of helps them look at each other and coordinate with each other, right? That's a key distinction. This is the distinction between the theory of the evolution of the nervous system as for the purposes of sensory motor processing versus for the idea that it's for self-coordination, solving the coordination problem within the organism, within the cell, or whatever it may be. I listened to part of an audiobook where this guy talked about octopus intelligence and this theory of like, look, there's the sensory motor interpretation where we say the nervous system must have evolved so that it could detect and sense things around and then process those sensory signals and output some kind of data that allows you to respond to the environment. Well, maybe that's a more sophisticated version of intelligence that comes later on. The first thing the nervous system does when it first, develops in whatever species, developed it or whatever cells, is, or maybe is, just helping the cell coordinate with itself. It's more like being the conductor of the orchestra, and every little piece of the cell knows that if it tunes into the same rhythm, that even though it can only see the starter of the rhythm and not everybody else, that everybody else who sort of has the faith to watch the same conductor rhythm and follow along will turn out to all be synchronized with each other. And that's what great performance artists of various kinds do. Musicians are a classic example. I had a girlfriend who saw a B.B. King concert, and she said it felt like it was just him and her in his living room as he played on Lucille all night. And musicians, they start with a self coordinating, just like life. The nervous system develops, and it's first just about self coordination. The musician taps into something within, and they coordinate, and more of their whole being coordinates, participates in the performance. If you leave off half the body, then you've left off a lot of your processing abilities, a lot of computation abilities. You've just become effectively dumber. So musicians tap into, how do we bridge the gap between the conscious and the subconscious? Let those meet in a way. It's something like using music as a tool to have those two handshake and integrate with each other. And so the music is used to touch each different note, touches a different part of you. And then you put the notes together and you're putting parts of yourself together. And it all starts to come together in this almost magical way, this almost super intelligent way. We don't normally think of it as super intelligent. We think of it as unexplainable, the X factor. And it's like, no, it's just a level of intelligence that goes beyond what we can rigorously and consciously reason about. You try to consciously and rigorously reason your way to a great musical performance. Maybe if you were a genius, planet-sized brain supercomputer or something. But as a human being, you're just not smart enough to do that. Doesn't matter who you are. And on the other hand, some musician can be much less intelligent than you in many ways. And yet, if they can make that handshake happen between subconscious and conscious, they can bring more of their whole being to bear, the expression of that whole being and not just part of it in the performance. Not knowing what they're going to do, because you have to find out, you have to let the computation run. And it's running like a tiny fraction of a second before it's time for you to act. So you can't know in advance what you're going to do. And musicians start out with self coordination, and then, just like the nervous system, they switch over to interpersonal coordination. The whole group, for a good musical performance, one that is really doing the sort of consciousness work, subconscious consciousness, we're fascinated by it. Our attention is just drawn into it. We can become absorbed by a proper musician in a flow state. And then we start, if you know anything about working with crowds, you've ever been in this experience, like everybody starts following this one fascinating shared point, the Schelling point of attention. And then you start to feel the whole crowd become a sort of slightly more unified thing. If the musician does certain musical things, the crowd all moves together. They cheer together, or they sigh together, or they just feel something inside together. And the musician now allows the whole group, now to the left and now to the right and this way and that. And they go from self coordinating to interpersonal group coordination. There's a wonderful depiction of this in Spartacus, where one of the slaves is a singer of songs or a poet, and Spartacus doesn't know what he's supposed to do with him at first. And then he gets up and he recites a poem, really well done, by the way, one of the best such scenes of its kind I've seen in any movie. And it's so good that Spartacus is like, wait a second, what was that? He says, I was wrong about you. You won't fight, you'll teach us songs. He says he wants to learn to fight, and he says an animal can learn to fight. But to sing beautiful things and to make people believe them. And he goes, And he becomes reflective. And that's the power of the poet and his song is done right. People become more conscious in the wake of these sorts of performances. And the performance is, with the whole slave army. So you experience it communally. You experience communion in that you feel like you're participating in a higher level of computation, and you could even say consciousness. And so maybe, some of these stories, they're hinting at the pattern of how we go from not having solved the coordination problem to having solved it on the level that, Martin Luther King did for a little while, or Gandhi, or Spartacus. But then, ideally, in a way that doesn't plateau and then ultimately get squashed one way or another or die out. Ideally, there's the version of it that is so wonderful that everybody wants it to persist and to grow. And sooner or later, we're basically just talking about Star Trek here. It's like, hopefully we eventually coordinate. It seems insane and impossible because it's never happened in the whole history of humanity. And on the other hand, it seems so sane and possible because it's literally just being like, oh, wait, we have not only all the things we need to make each other's lives wonderful, but basically nothing except what we have can make each other's lives wonderful. We are the source of all of the quality of life that we do or don't enjoy. We're just sitting here as a human species being like, oh, look, we have enough intelligence and manpower, arm power, and whatever power to make everything wonderful around the planet and solve most of our very stressful problems within a couple of weeks if we were to just really all use humanity's resources in a coordinated fashion to address humanity's problems. Toddler level intelligence. Even a toddler can be like, I don't like that. Can I try pushing on it or stepping away? These very basic abilities to respond to problems that humanity still does not display at the group level, at the global group level. And so these stories are maybe pointing out, okay, it doesn't start with the group equivalent of sensory motor processing. That's too far. No. It starts out with the most basic. It has to be basic. Maybe this is one of the reasons it's never worked. One is we didn't have a clear understanding of it. So instead, people who were morally very sacrificial or insightful or wise or loving, they sort of sometimes kicked off these patterns. They couldn't really explain them. And their followers couldn't recreate them later on. But maybe part of the reason that we've not been able to do this is, one, we didn't have a clear understanding, so it was happening more intuitively than anything else. And two, our visions always try to jump to the end. We're always immediately world peace utopia. And it's right, imagine that's level 10 and we're level 1. Maybe the reason we never get to level 10 and it seems so impossible is because we refuse to take our eyes off of 10 and look at 2. And that's where our attention needs to be, the very next step, something like that. And so what's the basic step? The basic step is not sensory motor processing, self-coordination first. It's something like what already happens in musical performances or in big moral or political movements sometimes. And we understand a little bit about how it functions on smaller scales, like in mold spores and in multicellular organisms. And we can take all of that and say, okay, step 1 is we need to find something that we can all fix our attention on together. And no, not enough just to do it. Maybe you and me, I don't know, whoever's watching, by the way, feel free to ask any questions about anything related to metamodernism or the particular thread I'm on right now. But like, I don't know, who you are or what other people around the world are doing. Are we both thinking about Michael Jordan at the same time? Like, maybe could happen. Somebody out there right now is thinking about Michael Jordan, and here I am, and oh my goodness, we're both doing it, but we don't know we're both doing it. And so we can't coordinate. If I knew there was somebody out there always thinking about Michael Jordan, I could theoretically start to be like, well, if their attention is always on a rather, let's say, arbitrary target, the arbitrariness isn't ideal, but the power of Schelling points, the power of shared attention is such that if I just decide to share that aim with them and let my attention go to the same thing their attention goes to, then what? And nothing seems especially available at first. But I don't know, imagine a headline comes out tomorrow, something about Michael Jordan. And I go, I bet this other guy who I magically know always is thinking about Michael Jordan, he must have, noticed that headline. And I've noticed it. So, because not only are we paying attention to the same thing, but at least one of us knows we're paying attention to the same thing, I can now like predict tiny little pieces of information about this person. Again, we've gone from zero to tiny. Still doesn't seem like much, but it's not zero. It's not nothing. I can now be like, oh, I bet this guy was thinking about this part of Michael Jordan's uh, career or whatever because of this headline. If he dies, I might be able to like think, hey, maybe he'll go to the funeral. I could go to the funeral. Would he be there? Maybe, maybe not. But like, there's some chance that we could meet and be like, I knew how to find you because we were sharing the same object of attention. And even though at first that didn't produce anything, as the object of attention zigged and zagged, as it altered across time, I was able to say, well, those alterations produced an echo in me and an echo in anybody else watching them. And so now I'm echoing and other people watching them, we're echoing together. And now we can build on that to coordinate in ways that would otherwise be impossible. And so if the first step of developing like new layers of human coordination is shared attention on the same object. And then like, I guess the next step, like maybe I should literally number these. Then like the next step is to like, okay, now you need to know you're all looking at the same object. Like, good job looking at it. Now you need to actually know you're all looking at it. That's great, level 2. And then level 3 is like, now that you all know you're following the same zigs and zags and you're all echoing together like a crowd, following the rise and fall of the same music. Hey, Mark, welcome. Now that you're all doing that, level 3 is maybe something like, what is the easiest, most basic thing to detect with that new level of coordination, computation, whatever? And maybe it's whatever the like roughest, most painful thing is. I have sort of this intuition that as we gain a new layer of, let's say, consciousness in some sense, one of the very first things it does is detect threats. You might say, well, it could detect anything. Why doesn't it detect food sources or sources of fuel or something? And it's like, well, probably the threats are more insistent in some sense. And so like level 3 is the baby developing consciousness can now like scream. It's not a very sophisticated strategy, but it exists for a reason and it is not nothing. So we're up to level 3 and like now we can scream when we don't like things. Well, according to me, humanity is already at level 3. We hit level 1 at COVID. We hit level 2 during the lockdowns. We hit 3 when we were screaming about COVID and other crises together as we all sort of, that's what I'm getting at, is we all focused on COVID together as a species. We all knew we were focusing on COVID together as a species. It would zig and zag and we'd all echo together and we all knew we were echoing together. And new layers of coordination and computation came out of that. And now we're able to scream and now we just want to get to level 4. And level 4 is like, along with screaming, we can like vaguely direct a little bit of sensory motor processing to like brush at problems in a vaguely coordinated way. Maybe that's enough to delay disasters, maybe enough to delay them such that we can get a little bit more coordinated and then actually solve them. All right. So, Marx, you're saying communion within bodies, love, right, does seem to solve the problem. However, not all bodies are capable of coordinating with each other. So, the issue becomes finding bodies for bodies to participate in. Finding like bodies, like here we might say, like a church, for example. A church is a sort of a body for human individual organism bodies to collectively participate in. And it's very interesting that in the Christian tradition the church is called the body of Christ. So the idea of we're unified, and this is a metaphor that Paul talks about, the Apostle Paul. He's like, some of us are the eyes and some of us are the fingers and some of us are the nose, and we all have our part to play in the body of Christ, in the church. Now, if the problem is not all bodies are capable of coordinating with each other, see, I've thought about this, for example, with the religions. So I'm like, if you listen to like Sam Harris, for example, his analysis, very simple, is like beliefs inform behaviors. The beliefs of Islam lead to the behaviors of Muslims. The beliefs of Christians and Buddhists lead to their behaviors. Because their beliefs do not align, it is impossible for them ever to coordinate. Therefore, our only solution is to red pill everyone with rational thought and reason so that we can finally abandon these silly belief structures, and then we will finally be able to shake hands now that the beliefs aren't getting in the way anymore. Finding a religion for churches to have communion. That's a very interesting idea. Communion. I mean, everything I was saying about like B.B. King and an artistic performance applies very much to communion, to I really need to know this. In the Mormon church, we would call it the sacrament, which is vague, I know, but that was the bread and the water, the Lord's Supper. I know it's sometimes called communion or something else. But anyway, yeah, that's a ritual, and everybody's sharing their attention on the same object, and they don't even just look together and feel together. They engage in coordinated action together. And so that's a deeper level of sort of interweaving our experiences, using a shared target of attention. And of course, God is supposed to be the idea of like, if we all share that same object of attention, then I can have my priest's code, you can have your warrior's code, and he can have his workman's code. But beneath all of that, we are all Christians. And that was a level of unity that religions provided. And you could say, look, my workman's code disagrees with your soldier's code. Now what? And the answer was, what does God say? And they say, well, we agree on that anyway. We share that in common. Yeah, whatever God says goes. It's like, cool. So now we can handshake. But now we're in a much more multicultural, globalist world. So now the religions have to handshake. And according to Sam Harris's analysis, that's impossible because they don't share the same beliefs. I am much less concerned with intellectual belief. It's, even if a religion literally said, we must, I don't know, make war with you forever. Even if the religion officially said that, you could, and then Sam Harris's analysis would seem correct. It's like, look, the belief is just, it says it right there. I mean, what are we going to do? They either have to abandon it or not. Otherwise, we're going to have eternal war. And I would say, yeah, if you think the belief just gets to dictate everything, but it doesn't. If the adherents of that belief system lived in a world where everybody around them was coordinating and being cooperative and like all of this sorts of things, I think it would have a huge role to play in whether or not the people actually got enough oomph together to coordinate to wage war on other people. And if the society was the right way, it would probably never happen. You don't need to resolve the belief differences. And likewise with the religions right now. They can't handshake, is what we think, because they can't have the same beliefs. I'm thinking, how can we get them to handshake in non-belief ways and then experience? Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. A communion, because part of the feeling of communion is that collective experience. It's communion when we're all listening to the guitar player and then we start to feel like a coordinated group. We all feel like one. We have a communion, a sacred experience of being part of something bigger than us. And people will often, when people have this feeling, I kind of feel like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, with her recent conversion to Christianity, has started to feel this sort of a thing. It's quite mysterious to me, the exact nature of it, but the way she says it, she keeps saying is like, is there nothing or is there something? And I've started to feel there is a something. And what people will then do often with experiences of communion is assume they know why they had them and where they're coming from. Churches and religion. Oh, you're thinking of individual local church sort of buildings within a religion. Well, then what about multiple religions within some sort of other communion structure? Um, but yes, it's very much this fractal pattern. Cells participate in organs. Organs participate in a body. Bodies participate in groups or a church or whatever it may be. And then the groups are all fighting each other. But hey, isn't it promising? Isn't it optimistic that the cells stopped fighting and came together? I don't know if we ever exactly could have said the organs were fighting before they came together, but the people, the individuals, were fighting a lot before they came together. Can we achieve new levels of coordination just as has happened over and over again? Even unprecedented, revolutionary changes in coordination. Again, as has already happened many times, not just somewhere in the universe, but in the same part of the universe that led to our creation, the very formation of our bodies. And it's like, well, that's another reason to be hopeful. If that same dynamic seems to occur over and over again, not just somewhere, but right here, right within me, within us, then it seems a little bit more solid to hope that it could happen again at a new layer of organization. Now, something like the global layer. And I have thought about metamodernism. Some people want to make a metamodern religion, and I've seen write-ups where they're like doing very complicated philosophical abstract notions of being and all this, and I'm like, there is no chance ever at all. Come on. I mean, who just to start any new religion at all is pretty crazy. And then you think this weird philosophical one is going to do better than all the ones that tried, that actually had at least some sense of how to reach people where they were. Like, there's nothing. But in my mind, metamodern religion more refers to a handshake between metamodernism and the religions that already exist. It's like, figure out all of our common ground. We've been focusing on our differences. Um, there are real differences. They're completely real, 100% real, not illusory. If we want, we can keep looking at them and looking at them and looking at them. It's just that after having looked at them for a long time, we've started to gain enough self-awareness to look at ourselves looking at them and notice that when we just look at this level of a thing, we get a lot of problems. So, is there something better we could do? This is the best thing we've done so far. We have no other alternative. To put it behind us is to step into chaos, a world with no answers, a hope of something that has never been seen before. It's like, yeah, but maybe worth looking at anyway. And maybe, you know, metamodernism can sort of shake hands with religions in the sense of saying, how can we help you get more of what you want while simultaneously looking for ways for the same initiatives that are self-benefiting to you, religion, whichever one you are simultaneously for the common good. Good faith efforts to contribute to making humanity more integrated, coordinated at all layers, not just the local ones. And not necessarily, we're not saying, here's part of the thing that I think has been missing. We're not saying sacrifice yourself for the common good. That's a tough sell. I don't know if that'll spread very well. No, we're saying don't sacrifice yourself. Get even more of what you want and contribute to the common good at the same time. Throw out this zero-sum game where it's like, well, I can either give my 2 pennies to the church or I can give them to myself. And it's like, no, there's this other game where we have a positive sum game where you get more and everybody gets more together at the same time. And it happens to some degree even automatically, if and only if people are coordinating in good faith. But that is the magic. Like, the part of the magic here is we're so focused on this sort of strategy of, what can I understand? What can I model? What are my systems? What are my principles that I can use to make decisions? And then the next time the decision comes, I just want to copy paste the same answer and copy and paste and copy and paste. Treat these different moments as if they were identical and to blur out the differences between them. Blur out the differences between them. Copy paste answers. Intellectual systems. We already know that kind of thinking can only go like so far. It can't compete with musical performances, for example. It can't compete with swarm intelligence. And so what I'm talking about that would be more coordinated would be something like the swarm intelligence that humanity could, and in theory, just inevitably would display if people genuinely believed they had a shared context of good faith engagement with each other. That's it. If you have that, you're like the mold spore. And at that point, you don't need to map from A to B to know how to grow to the food source. If you just have the emergent coordination that happens all by itself, as soon as people or entities in the group dynamic participate in good faith, aiming at a common target that is self-benefiting and group benefiting at the same time. If you just get that, again, you don't have to map it out yourself. You don't have to make the plans. The food discovery, the opportunity exploitation happens by itself once people trust that their first efforts to engage with the thing, but in good faith, will be met by others also engaging in good faith. And that my good faith failure mixed with your good faith failure will lead, if we keep talking and dialoguing and relying on each other, together our good faith failures can add up to an emergent swarm intelligence that can solve problems that our most sophisticated intellectual thinking cannot compete with. A communion is to some end always. Oh, you mean it's pointed at some end always. The communion can only, that's an interesting thought. If we all look at the same object, wouldn't we get some kind of communion maybe? Or do we have to also have the same goal in mind for the object? The musician thing only works because we all sort of have the same, or many of us share the same goal of like enjoying the music or whatever it is. That's an interesting thought. So this is why a parasite is considered a parasite. It orders you towards its own end via your acceptance of it into your union and destroys your end. Yeah, that sounds like a virus. I did a comparison, I guess this was yesterday, between this is using the Christian tradition. It's sort of the idea of the spirit of Christ and the spirit of Antichrist. And the idea, Mark, we were just talking about this a little bit the other day, but yeah, a virus in my mind is like the spirit of Antichrist. It's a unifying spirit, actually, just like the spirit of Christ, but it unifies by eliminating difference. and where differences cannot coexist or be squashed into conformity and consonance, uh, complete division occurs because the dissonance of different notes, so to speak, cannot be tolerated. And this is a self-destructive thing that does not increase in intelligence. But the Spirit of Christ or Logos or something else is like this. It is also a unifying spirit, but it harmonizes as well. And what harmony means is you have different notes that don't match, but they don't match the right way. They don't match in a way that lines up with each other just right. And as a result, you get the emergence of swarm intelligence. On this sort of foundation of love and harmony proceeds outcomes intelligence, new layers of intelligence and power. So I've riffed about this. Mark, you and I in particular, I know, have talked a little bit about these specific ideas before. So let me think here. 9 or 10 minutes left. The big picture idea here is something like map out how new layers of coordination arise as they've arisen many times before, and then recreate those patterns with the human superorganism. And if it on some level seems impossible, it's worth noting that on some other level, it almost seems inevitable. Maybe not right now. Right now, maybe it just is impossible, and we're just going to try and we'll fail. But on some level, it almost seems inevitable that it goes Star Trek at some point. You're just going to keep warring forever. You never ever figure out a way to just stop shooting each other in the foot. Surely you eventually figure it out. The only question is, what are the requirements before you can figure it out and get your act together? Is it even possible for us to do that right now? It doesn't exactly look like we're right on the cusp of amazing coordination, but I thought about writing something it would be called like 10 reasons we can't solve the coordination problem and one that we can. Something like this. Because people keep being like, here are all the reasons coordination is hard and it's failed before. And I'm like, yeah, I know, like obviously. I don't even expect for it to work. It's just the best path forward either way. And good news is I'm not like sacrificing myself to it. I'm doing okay while I'm trying to participate in it. And the third, third win is, and if I face some horrible end or we face some disastrous end, I think that the same path I'm trying to figure out will help me face that horrible end too. So it's a win-win-win. The problems are big. Try and solve them in a way that your life is okay in the meanwhile, and in a way that makes it maximally okay if you come to a horrible, disastrous end. Prepare at the same time. So nothing's being sacrificed, and so what might indicate that we could successfully coordinate? If we could, today, not today, but like now in this time in history, in our global context. And a couple of things come to mind. One is we have technology that can allow an idea to get around the whole world in a single day. If you had an extremely viral video, yeah, in theory, if it was so viral that everybody who watched it was like, oh, I want to see if anybody hasn't watched this and show it to them. If you had something that viral, the technology is already in place such that the message could, cover the planet in a single day. That helps. You can imagine a past world where somebody figured it out. Some city where they were so wonderfully harmonized and coordinated, and 99% of the world never even knew it happened. Maybe it has happened. Who knows? In history. But so we have the technology. The other thing I think we have that might help is we have crises. Like everybody looks at our crises and they're like, oh no, we're not coordinating to handle these very well. I guess we can't coordinate. And it's like, well, just think a couple of years in the future. We continue to fail. Good, good, good. Because think about what happens if we continue to fail. The crises get worse. The crises get worse, and people begin to consider more outlandish alternatives. You know, when things get really bad, people will do horrible things if they think it'll give them a way out. But when things get bad, they will take a chance on wonderful things if it gives them hope that they can somehow get out of it. And so, in my mind, there's a saying. It says something like, um, I don't know if it's an actual saying. It's like a dynamic. It says something like, if you think something should happen, it probably won't happen. But if you have a plan for it, and then later people are looking for a plan, they might pick yours if it's already around. It's something like, if there's a crisis, suddenly everybody looks for a plan. And all the plans that nobody cared about before suddenly become very interesting. So the idea is not necessarily, here's the thing that can spread in today's environment well. It's more like, here's the thing that could spread in tomorrow's environment well. Maybe. That's the hope anyway. Um, so we've got the technology, we've got looming crises that can galvanize harmony. We have a little bit of foresight. I think we're a very intellectually developed culture. I wonder if we're intellectually hitting way above our weight relative to our ability to just like not cause problems for ourselves and each other. But nonetheless, we have this great wealth of intellectual knowledge and understanding. We can do what maybe nobody has ever been able to do in history, which is actually understand with clear concepts, not like vague metaphors and like spiritual teachings that only a tiny percentage of people can understand. And even then, dimly through a glass. I mean, no, we can like articulate with some real conceptual precision and rigor the pathway by which things go from pre-swarm intelligence to swarm intelligence and how that gap is crossed. We can look at things like the development of nervous systems. We can look at things like octopuses. Like, we just have science and philosophy and analysis developed to pretty strong arts. So if we could actually prove that, so to speak, that there's a path from point A to point B, it's right there on paper, and anybody who's willing to read the paper and understand it can be like, oh yeah, that would work. That's something that our culture might be able to do that hasn't been available in the past. Not that we can do it right now, but if we start trying to do it, if we start failing together and then supporting each other in our failures, trying to find ways to redeem them and turn them towards the shared goal. Maybe we can put together a plan. Maybe a crisis hits. Maybe people are willing to try the hopeful plan instead of whatever horrible Nazi-esque alternatives come up, because that's what happened with the Nazis. They had a very rough time of it, and they were willing to go for a pretty desperate plan because they thought it might help. And it's like, right. Testament to what people are willing to do when they're desperate. So maybe we can make a plan, maybe a crisis hits or multiple crises, and then maybe people are willing to consider such plans, and the technology is present that the plans can actually spread more or less instantaneously around literally the entire planet. And that's just three pieces of it. We have, in my mind, we're at the beginning of a dialogue that will produce many, many new insights and perspectives that will empower us in ways that we can't imagine right now. The dialogues that can exist but haven't existed between religions and other realms of human excellence. If we can just get them to talk to each other and not to lecture at each other and not to point out how the other side is fundamentally missing your presuppositions, and the East seems to always tell the West that they just don't understand how deep their teachings are, and the West always tells the East that nothing they say makes sense anyway. And it's like, our dialogues suck. Metamodernism hopefully can lay out not anything too ambitious. I hope it's not too ambitious to say we can develop a conversational template, sort of, let's say, that can just facilitate a productive dialogue between people who don't agree with each other. If we can get all the representatives of realms of human excellence, religions and philosophies and etc., to really talk to each other and effectively compare notes, then out of those compared notes will come new insights. And then with those new insights, we can start all over. We can look with new eyes on the coordination problem. We can look for new opportunities, new obstacles. We'll just be the better version of ourselves for trying to figure this out. A distributed reputation engine that would rank humans according to their development of knowledge, character, and skills. I've thought of something like that, yes. It's been a while since I thought too much about it. I start thinking about the details like, okay, how do you give people the ability to rate you? And then what if they, abuse that? And then how do you make it self-enforcing so that good faith use of ratings leads to more power? They rate themselves. They say themselves if they have good character or not. I have amazing character. I have the best character around. Yeah, I rate myself very highly. Yeah, I don't know what to. On the one hand, because I don't want to neglect any potential tools, so I'm emphasizing these like wooier ideas, non-distributed intelligence and these sorts of things. And on the other hand, I'm like super on board with like we have awesome analytical tools, and would us we have we rely on technology, and would a distributed reputation engine that somehow allowed people to something like skip past trust formation, because that's basically what a distributed reputation engine is. It's a sort of fancy handshake. Vervaeke talks about the handshake as an invention, a tool, a psychotechnology invented so that human beings felt like they could trust each other a little bit more. And you can criticize it to pieces, but it works, or it worked. They shook hands, they trusted each other a little bit more, less war, more prosperity. Cool. A distributed reputation engine is basically a way of letting people rapidly shake hands without having to laboriously vet each other. And in a way that is maybe, because like if you're a con man, you can just be very convincing. But if you've received a whole bunch of negative reputation things, then we solve that problem as well. And now there's less of a differential between people who are socially skilled and people who aren't. And so there's a democratization, there's an acceleration of cooperation and integration in theory. Yeah. The other idea is that like we want this to sort of happen bottom up. And this is something maybe I should think about. Or, like with all of these, I'm a little bit like, I think about it until I can get someone else to think about it or help me think about it. Somebody should think about, okay, which things should we hit with the bottom up self coordinating approach? And which things should we say, nah, let's stick with the top down planning? Credit is a trust replacement system, like financial credit, credit scores. I mean, we do rely on credit scores to make handshakes with each other. So that's true. Yeah. But yeah, do we want a bottom up trust system or a top down one? I don't know. I mean, AI, because we've talked about with some other metamodern people about like a platform where people can all go and have a bunch of like talks with each other, video calls, like online in parallel. But then an AI listens to everything everybody's saying and says, oh, you are talking about metamodernism that like 99% of people aren't talking about. There's one other guy is talking about it. You two want to talk? And like, I actually think that could make a really enormous difference. Like the distributed trust reputation engine would make an enormous difference if it worked. Because who are my top 1,000 collaborators? Who are the best friends I could ever have? Where are the best potential partners, romantic partners for me? Like that's like my whole life. We're talking about your romances and your work, and it's like so much of it is just being like, yeah, I don't know. There's like somewhere exists a group of people who would just immediately be delighted and be interested in working together on this. and I just don't know where to send an email. I just don't know where to send it. So an AI that could theoretically just do even the most basic rudimentary, oh, you two seem like you might want to talk to each other, like scaled up. Is that the world we're about to live in? It's like, hey, here's 10 potential romantic partners who are more compatible with you than anybody you would find any other way. Here's a list of 100 potential friends and a list of 100 potential collaborators. That would be a pretty cool world to live in, and might not even require too much intelligence. Wouldn't require a dangerous AI, something I'm very concerned about. So yes, I feel like a distributed reputation engine of some kind could be immensely valuable. I'd love to hear further thoughts on it. It makes me wonder how to know when to use bottom up versus top down approaches. And that's worth thinking about. If either of you think of anything, do let me know. I want to wrap up here, but if there are any final comments before I go, it's been great to have both of you, and thanks for stopping by. All right. I think that's it. So I'll leave it there, and I hope to see you again. Bye. Thanks, Chase. You too.